Chag Sameach. As we move into the Yizkor service today, I want to reflect on an English word that is used to translate two very different Hebrew words. The English word is to redeem, and I'd like to suggest that as we move towards Yizkor today, that there are two Hebrew words, lifdot and ligol, that have a very different meaning, even though they are both used to speak of the same English word, that they mean very different things to us. So Shabbat morning, we learned of the rescue of Noah Argamani, Amog Meir, Andrei Koslov, and Shlomi Ziv, who were held hostage in a civilian apartment building in Gaza. And of course, in the media, there were two different ways that this story was told. So in many news outlets, the word was Israel rescues hostages. In a couple of outlets, it was reported as Hamas releases hostages, which is kind of like Pete Rose retires from baseball, or kind of like Queen Elizabeth steps down. Yes, but no. But it brings to the fore, what does it mean to redeem, to release, to rescue, to save? And in fact, there are two different words that our tradition has that are not used interchangeably, but that have significant implications. So one is pidyon. So pidyon often is translated as redeem. So pidyon, we actually read about in our Torah portion this past week, when the Levites are being traded for the firstborn. That is a pidyon. So even to this day, by the way, if a child is a firstborn male child, on the 30th day of his life, and once he has made it to 30 days, he is redeemed, and that ceremony is called a pidyon haben, a redemption of the firstborn. And similarly, if anyone happens to raise sheep or donkeys or other animals, there too there is supposed to be a redemption of the firstborn. In the book of Ruth, in the book that we read today, there is a different word that is used, and that phrase is geula, which is also translated as redemption. You'll remember that Ruth is a widow. Her husband died in the land of Moab. She is a Moabite. And the question is, who will lift her out of poverty and widowhood? And the word that is used 24 times in the book of Ruth is geula, ligol, gaal. And the idea is that the only way that she is to be redeemed is if someone from her former husband's family is to marry her. And in the process, Gaal will redeem the fields that belong to her husband's family. So she is spiritually stuck. There is someone who is thinking about doing it. We don't know his name. He's called Ploni Almoni, which literally means Mr. Anonymous. It's Hebrew for John Doe. Ploni Almoni decides, I don't want to do it because I don't want to have to buy back this field. I don't want to be the Goel. You, Boaz, you do it. And so we have these two different ideas, one that we read about on Shabbat of pidyon, redemption, and the other is geula, also redemption. How are they the same? How are they different? And how does that guide us as we think about those we are remembering today? So the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, says that in fact you can see examples of both in the Exodus, and understanding that will give you the insight. So pidyon is redemption through a trade of one for the other. So I killed the Egyptian firstborn, and you are now mine in exchange. So that is a pidyon, a trade one for one. Taking them out of Egypt is geula, is redemption, is saving by sheer force. There is no switcheroo, there is no exchange. I am taking what I want, you have no choice. There's not a deal. And so if we want to think about what is going on now in the land of Israel, we can perhaps understand the two different ways that hostages might be redeemed or released. A trade of prisoners for ceasefire or prisoners for hostages, that is pidyon. And in fact, in ancient Hebrew and modern Hebrew, there's the idea of pidyon shvuim. Through most of Jewish history, when Jews were taken captive, which they were often, the redemption of those captives was called pidyon shvuim, redemption of captives, because the assumption was you were going to buy them back. It's not a trade, it's a trade, it's a swap, right? I'm going to give you this many shekels or drachmas or francs, and we are going to get the Jews out in exchange. And so pidyon is, in that sense, what happened in the fall when, in the weeks shortly after, there was a temporary ceasefire and women and children were let go in exchange for Palestinians who were doing time in Israeli jail. What happened on Shabbat was geula. We didn't ask anyone. We didn't seek permission. We went in, we took, we saved without offering anything in return. But the truth is, the boundaries between pidyon and geula are a little bit porous. Because if you look at the story of Ruth, I mentioned there's a first person, there's a first Goel, this guy Ploni Almoni, John Doe, Mr. Anonymous, who is given the chance to redeem Ruth. He says, you know what? The price is too high because I'm going to have to buy this field and that's going to cost me money. I'm going to have to give up something. And so the truth is, whenever human beings attempt geula, nothing is ever for free. And so when you think about what happened on Saturday, that redemption was at a cost. It came at the cost of the commander of that rescue operation, Arnon Zamora. So whenever human beings attempt geula, whenever we attempt to redeem by force, ultimately there's some aspect of pidyon as well. And so that is a question that Israel is wrestling with, that is afflicting the very soul of Israel at this moment. And that is the debate that you hear in Israel. If you are on the streets, if you are in Hostage Square, if you're on the highways, if you're in the Knesset, the question is, will Israel try to get its hostages back through pidyon, a trade, a ceasefire, or geula by force? But we understand that even geula, even redemption by force, still has a cost. The other place where the word goel, geula, appears is, you'll see it coming up in the book of Numbers and again in Deuteronomy. There's goel hadam, the redeemer, the blood redeemer. The story goes that, let's say a person is killed through manslaughter. The person who is responsible for the death didn't mean to kill them, it was an accident. The family of the dead person can come and seek revenge. Goel hadam can seek blood revenge. There is a blood feud between two groups, and the Torah offers a way to diffuse that for the person to go into exile instead. But ultimately, geula has that aspect perhaps of revenge as well, right? That it is not just give back, it's not just a trade, but geula also comes perhaps with payback. When God takes the Jews out of Egypt, God just doesn't take them out, but there is a cost to the Egyptians, right? It is a heads I win, tails you lose. And so when we think about what it might mean for Israel to undertake geula, there is a cost to those on our side. There is certainly a cost to innocent people on the other. Now let me be clear, I shed no tears for Abdallah al-Jamal, who was a journalist. So it turned out he was only a stringer for Al Jazeera, like he worked for Al Jazeera like I worked for the Atlanta Jewish Times. Yeah, I wrote an article once. But he actually was employed by a Palestinian news agency that is supported by a nonprofit here in the United States. So there are donations to charity here in the United States. People got tax deductions to pay the guy who was keeping the Israelis hostage. So I shed no tears for him. You don't want to get shot by the IDF, don't keep hostages in your home, right? On the other hand, right, when Hamas is firing RPGs at people and you're shooting back, people get killed who really were not involved. I feel bad for them. There's a cost. I would not have Israel do it any differently, but you acknowledge that there is a cost to Geula. Another way of thinking about Pidyon and Geula, about redemption and redemption. The Khatam Sofer, who was a Hungarian sage about 200 years ago, wrote that Pidyon refers to negative redemption. Pidyon is just being about being saved from whatever you had, while Geula is not just about being saved, it is about being lifted up. So that's the difference, right? If you were a firstborn and you have a Pidyon, a ben, okay, so before you were bound to God, now you're still just a firstborn. Geula means being lifted up, right? Ruth ends up, when the story is over, being even more elevated than she was before. Because before, she was just married to one of Elimelech's sons. Now she is married to Boaz, and she is going to be the mother of King David. Geula means you are better off even than before everything went bad. Pidyon is, I just got back to where I was. Pidyon is temporary relief. Geula means that there is something everlasting, that you end up better than you started. When God steps in, there is real Geula. Human beings, often the best we can do is Pidyon. So in a few moments, we're going to move into the Yizkor service, and it's my first time with you since my first Yizkor sermon on October 7th itself. Think about those who we have lost, those who were killed in captivity. I think about the Israeli soldiers who have died trying to fight to save those who are captive, trying to protect Israel, trying to eliminate those who want to murder us. I think about all those who are lost. And my hope is their sacrifice a Pidyon or is it a Geula? Is their sacrifice something that just gets us back to where we were? That we are sitting on this side and Hamas is sitting on the other? Or is there Geula? Is there actually a change for the better in the world, that we are actually better off than we were on October 6th? Those are questions that I don't have good answers for you today. But even as we remember those who were murdered on October 7th and those who have continued to fight thereafter, it's appropriate to do that on Yizkor Day because Yizkor was enacted to remember those who gave their lives as martyrs. Originally, Yizkor was not on remembering my Aunt Frida. Originally, Yizkor was remembering the communities that were wiped out in crusades and pogroms, who had no one to remember them. There were no yard sites during the year, so on this day, on the holiest days, on Yom Kippur, on Shmini Atzeret, on Shavuot, on Passover, those were the days when we would remember whole communities that had no one to remember them. But we are here, perhaps to remember them, and I hope we will. And in fact, I would invite you, even if you normally step out for Yizkor because you don't have anyone who is close to you, think about staying in because there are those who have no one to remember them. But we are here to remember our loved ones. We are here to remember our fathers, our mothers, our husbands, our wives, our brothers, our sisters, God forbid, our children. We're here to remember friends and loved ones. We're here to remember those losses of the everyday. And I would note that when I'm called upon, when I come and say vidui for someone, the confessional prayer for someone who's about to die, almost the very last words of the vidui as it is said for someone who is dying are padita oto, you have redeemed him. That in some sense, death is in of itself a form of redemption. Because in the vidui we say, let our death be in exchange for all of the wrong we have done in this world. Let us come into heaven with a clean slate. And so death is ultimately a pidyon. Death is ultimately a saying, I give up this life in exchange for a life yet to come. I give up my presence in this world for a place in eternity. Geula, true redemption, only comes at the end of days, at a time, in a place, in a way that we can only begin to conceive. As we enter the Yizkor service, we can think about the tough choices that are being made 7,000 miles away. We can think about the sacrifices that have been made. We are also in this moment trying to relate to those who we have lost. So I want to leave us with a question that perhaps is also hard to answer, but that is very much more personal. As we relate to those who we have lost, as we are about to say the Yizkor service, do we think of what we do for them in terms of pidyon or in terms of geula? When we say the Yizkor service, we are seeking to redeem those who we have lost. And the way that we redeem them is by the way that we live our lives. Do we live our lives as pidyon, simply trying to make up for what was? So my father gave charity in this way, I'm going to give charity in that way. I remember my grandfather used to this, and so now I'm Zaidi, I'm going to do that because he led Seder, so now I lead Seder. Bubby used to make the matzo ball soup, now I make the matzo ball soup. Or perhaps we come into this moment in a spirit of geula, of saying that our loved ones, our ancestors, our mothers, our fathers inspire us, but we are not simply a trade or an exchange for them, but that in fact we have the agency, we have the power, we have the ability, we have the mandate to do more. That is not just enough to reproduce, to be a swap. You had Zaidi, now you got me. You had Bubby, now you got me. No. We have the ability, the responsibility, the opportunity to bring redemption not as pidyon but as geula. To say that we are going to do more. That we are going to do not just in trade for what came before, but we are going to elevate. We are going to leave the word better than we found it. We are not just going to replicate what the generations before did, but we are going to add. We are going to do more. We are going to be more generous. We are going to be more pious. We are going to be kinder. We are going to be braver. Because if we just replace our ancestors, if it's just an even swap, we haven't done enough. So I don't know how the problems of our brothers and sisters in Israel will be solved. I pray that they are, and I pray that by the next time we are together for Yizkor, that there are no more names to remember, and that perhaps, in fact, we can celebrate that there has been geula, or at least a worthwhile pidyon. But what I know is that as we gather for Yizkor at this moment, we can ourselves commit to geula rather than pidyon. We can commit ourselves to not just be an even trade, not just do what the generations before us did, but to do more, to do better, to try harder, to elevate, to leave things a bit better than we found them. And if we do, then perhaps the memories of those we remember here today will in fact be elevated by what we believe, by what we say, and by what we do. I'm going to ask those who are honored with carrying the Torah scrolls and open the ark to please come forward as we prepare to begin the Yizkor service.